Donald Trump got elected twice by saying, I know what's scaring you, and I'm going to fight back against it. And I heard at these UFC events from his fans when he entered at Madison Square Garden, at some point in the 15-minute standing ovation, I was talking to a couple of kids, and one of them said, I like that he enters like a fighter. Like, it gives me hope to see this political figure come out here, do a fighter walkout.
We've talked a lot on the show about why young men in America are turning toward Trump, but we've never talked about one of the biggest parts of that story, a mixed martial arts company called Ultimate Fighting Championship, or UFC. For a lot of men under age 45, and especially men who are maybe not otherwise engaged in politics, Trump is synonymous with two things: manosphere podcasters like Joe Rogan and the UFC. Because it's not just a sport, the UFC is a culture and a way of seeing the world, and it's proven it can speak to young male audiences in a way that no one else is really able to right now. Joining me today is the reporter Jack Crosbie, who has a news story for Rolling Stone on how the UFC became one of the most important cultural forces on the American right. And I wanted to have Jack on to talk about why the UFC is striking such a chord with young men and what that tells us about the needs or desires leading those men to the sport and therefore to Trump. Jack, welcome to Offline.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Max.
So for people who have maybe never seen a mixed martial arts fight, paint a picture for us. How does it look or sound different from, say, a regular boxing match?
Mixed martial arts basically combines a whole bunch of different distinct styles of combat sports and distinct styles of, fighting, I would say, martial arts, and has codified them under a rule set into an actual sport. So an MMA fight will incorporate boxing, similar to Western boxing techniques, striking with the fists from the waist up, but it will also incorporate American kickboxing, and in particular Thai boxing, which is Muay Thai, which incorporates strikes with the shins, with the knees, with the feet, and crucially with the elbows as well. And a mixed martial arts fight, you're allowed to hit the other person with basically any part of your body besides a headbutt. And what differentiates MMA from, say, Muay Thai or kickboxing, where a lot of this is also allowed, is that when a fighter in a boxing fight or in a purely striking fight, when a fighter falls to the ground, the fight is paused. That fighter is either stood up if they can, and the fight is resumed, or if they stay on the ground, they're considered to be knocked out. In mixed martial arts, someone falling over does not stop the fight. And in fact, in a lot of matches, that is where the real battle really begins. Something will break. And often in these fights, things do break, or people are choked unconscious in relatively rare cases. But this is very much a possibility of what can happen to you in an MMA fight.
It sounds really brutal, which the reason I want to kind of dwell on that is I think that's a really important part of MMA's appeal, right? It's not just a different set of techniques and rules, but my sense is that it's kind of the vibe is a really big part of UFC and MMA. And I think of boxing as kind of a gentlemanly sport, and UFC mixed martial arts is a little more blood sport, right?
So you have been conditioned by the boxing lobby to think this over many, 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 many years. These were the original arguments against mixed martial arts. In the early 2000s, John McCain called it human cockfighting because of the permissiveness of the rule set and the perceived brutality of the sport. And to be fair, MMA does lean into this. But proponents of the sport, including myself, I think, would say that there's really... getting hit in the face is getting hit in the face. There's really nothing that much more brutal about an MMA fight than there is a boxing fight. There's even some research to suggest, which, I can kind of personally attest to, that being hit with a boxing glove that weighs a pound on either fist it's someone is swinging, a large club that weighs a pound into your head. And there have been studies that have shown that boxers often will incur more head trauma over the course of their fights than a typical MMA athlete would be. And that's also because in boxing, remember, you can only hit from the waist up. In MMA, there are leg kicks, there are body kicks and blows and punches, and then there's all the grappling on the ground. So it kind of depends on what you what you see is brutality, I think.
So I feel like UFC's rise has been pretty recent. Like a few years ago, I had barely heard of it, and now it's kind of everywhere. Can you talk about how that happened?
Yeah, so the UFC, I mean, has had a really, really good past 4 years. The sport was kind of this nascent cultural phenomenon, I guess, for many, many years. The UFC itself started as a company in the early 1990s, but it didn't really get off the ground and attain any kind of sort of mainstream recognition until the kind of mid 2000s, and in fact, really early 2010s, mid 2010s. The current CEO of the company, CEO and president, Dana White, took over the company in 2001 with some financial backing from a couple of friends of his, and he has essentially run the ship since then. And I think he can be credited mostly with popularizing this sport and making it go mainstream to a much wider audience, both in the United States and around the world. And he's done that through a couple of different ways. I think when you probably first heard of UFC, and when many people first heard of UFC, was probably around the early 2010s when Dana White kind of realized the star power and sort of figured out the marketing concoction that he needed to really create stars out of his fighters. He was aided by perhaps the most famous MMA athlete in the world, Conor McGregor, an Irishman who was just, as brash as could be on the mic. He was, had similar rhetorical techniques that, made Donald Trump famous, made everyone. He never backs down, is always up for a fight, is always ready to say the most outlandish and headline grabbing thing possible. And McGregor backed that up by the fact that in the ring, his fights were just as electrifying and just as exciting. And he was really, I see it as really the UFC's breakout moment into the mainstream of global culture, where people knew who Conor McGregor was.
You hinted at something I think important, which is that there's something kind of Trump coded about this sport, or there's a way in which it has naturally aligned with Trump. Can you talk about the kind of UFC Trump alliance? Because I have to say, I did not realize until I read your story how important they have been to one another.
So there's a couple of things there. The UFC is directly connected to Donald Trump through a whole bunch of different avenues, which I'll get into. But I think what's interesting about what you said is saying that, like, some of these things, the UFC being Trump coded, I'm not entirely sure. So I think the cultural impetus that both Donald Trump and the UFC are tapping into is older than Donald Trump itself. It's not necessarily Donald Trump coded. It's reality TV coded, to be honest. And people make a big deal about the UFC and its differences with what we now know as professional wrestling, the WWE, and these big shows that got really popular in the 90s. And the sort of the wrestling term is kayfabe, the manufactured drama and the putting on a personality for the fans and to tell a storyline of the fights. The UFC does a lot of this as well. And it found, especially in the Conor McGregor years, it found a huge amount of success in treating its fighters like they were characters. And in fact, one of the UFC's other major breakout moments was in the season finale of a reality TV show that Dana White had created called The Ultimate Fighter, in which he took a dozen UFC prospects and he forced them all to live in a house with one another for several months and fight each other on the weekends. And there were some really breakout moments in this where the sport was allowed to shine through the characters that had been developed through this, this sort of storylining and giving those people space to breathe. And when you think about how Donald Trump really introduced himself to the country, he was a known quantity for years and years, not really because of his real estate deals, not really because of anything like that, but because he went on TV all the time and he hosted a show called The Apprentice. And this theme of the people involved in this sport being able to capture popular audiences, being able to meet them where they were at, being able to just inherently know what is going to entertain people is a really consistent theme. in the piece that I wrote for Rolling Stone, I kind of explored the UFC through the axis of a trifecta of people who have all been involved with it very closely from the beginning. Two of those, of course, are Dana White and Donald Trump, who we've discussed. But the third is Joe Rogan, who at the time in the early UFC, when Dana White took over the UFC, Joe Rogan was the host of a reality TV show of Fear Factor. And that's how he became popular around the country. And these three men all kind of understood that the catharsis and drama that comes from a sport like the UFC, like MMA, which is as close as you can get to just pure fighting, to two people in combat under a rule set that, doesn't utilize weapons or result in death. The draw and the appeal that would have to people, especially if surrounded by some of these elements of dramatic tension and sort of bringing these stories of these individuals and athletes into it, was something that was going to really be irresistible for a lot of the country.
Yeah, I want to ask you more about this idea that I found so interesting, that the UFC has figured out how to speak to certain people in a way that has proven really powerful, and that kind of parallels the way that Trump has figured out how to speak to those same people, because I think it tells us a lot about Trump's appeal, understanding how the UFC has kind of approached this. So you write in your piece that the UFC rose in part by filling a latent demand for violence and catharsis in America. And I'm really curious whether people within kind of UFC world, if it's people who work for the company itself or kind of in the media environment around it, do they see their sport this way, as filling a cultural need or demand that goes beyond just sports entertainment?
Absolutely. I think they might not explicitly discuss it all of the time.
Sure.
But in my conversations with Dana White and in many other interviews he's given, he said quotes to the effect of, human beings will always be fascinated with fighting. There's nothing like fighting. There is nothing like this sport. There's nothing sort of more primal, more connected to the spirit of human competition in general than professionalized violence, essentially. I mean, if you look at something I thought about while reporting this piece as well, basically all of the sports that we play now, at least almost all of the team sports, you can make an argument for things like, tennis that have devolved significantly from their roots or whatever, but a lot of the sports are modeled on forms of warfare. The entire family of sports that has resulted in both soccer and American football now started from, a version of sort of football, as it was called, which was two villages chasing a pig bladder from one end to the other, trying to beat the absolute crap out of each other the entire time. It was a battle between two towns with a sort of secondary objective of a ball going from one place to another to simulate combat. People watch American football both for the plays and for the athleticism of the sport, but they want to see the big hits. People watch NASCAR for the crashes. People watch hockey for the fights, right? That man on man or woman on woman, person on person conflict is really at the heart of all competition. And I think what Dana White has realized is that MMA distills that impulse and puts it on screen in a way that is more pure, really, than any other sport out there. It cuts to the core of what we're watching all of this for. And I think that can be disconcerting to a lot of people who don't necessarily like the impulses that they maybe get from other sports to be put on such stark display. But to me, at least, I played sports most of my life. I enjoy watching basically all of them. I love the UFC and I love MMA because there's a real athleticism and beauty to the sport at the heart of it, to what practitioners of it have to sacrifice to become good at it, and also to just what being truly talented at it can represent.
Offline is brought to you by Quince. Elevating your style used to mean breaking the bank, but with Quince, you can get high-end, versatile pieces at prices you can actually afford. Now you can upgrade your style by snagging killer luxury essentials that sync with your vibe and wallet. Quince has all the must-haves like Mongolian cashmere sweaters from $50, iconic 100% leather jackets, and comfortable pants for every occasion. The best part, all Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. By partnering directly with top factories, Quince cuts out the cost of the middleman and passes the savings on to us. And Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices along with premium fabrics and finishes. I love that. I just bought some T-shirts.
You did?
From Quince. Yeah, it's getting nicer out here in LA.
It is.
Starting to get warmer. It's going to be T-shirt weather.
I didn't need my fleece for my morning dog walk.
Nope, so I needed some new T-shirts. I looked at Quince. They got some great T-shirts there. They got some great Henleys. Been known to wear Henley once in a while.
Guy loves a fucking Henley.
Yeah, and very affordable. Indulge in affordable luxury. Go to quince.com/offline for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/offline to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/offline. Offline is brought to you by Armor Colostrum. Everyone's looking for ways to be healthier and stave off winter illnesses. Give your immunity and gut health their best chance with Armor Colostrum. Discover the transformational health benefits of Armor Colostrum that have earned tens of thousands of 5-star reviews. Probiotics and other supplements are touted as a gut health solution, but most products on the market are dead before they even reach your gut. Armor Colostrum naturally fortifies your entire gut wall system and optimizes your whole body microbiome, which helps guard against irritants that can trigger digestive issues and compromise your immune system. Research has shown that colostrum helps to enhance nutrient absorption. Armor Colostrum can help stabilize blood sugar levels, modulate hormones, and ignite your metabolism. This enhanced nutrient absorption has been a closely guarded secret of elite athletes like John Lovett. Let Armor Colostrum help you reach your goals by promoting lean muscle building and fueling cellular repair regeneration to fuel better performance and faster recovery. Colostrum bioactives have also been shown to reactivate hair follicle stem cells and activate collagen production, promoting hair growth and enhancing skin radiance.
Well, I'd love to be radiant.
It's important. We've worked out a special offer for my audience. Receive 15% off your first order. Go to tryarmor.com/offline or enter offline to get 15% off your first order. That's TRYARMRA.com/offline.
So what do you think is the kind of, because it's a very good point about the universal, or at least potentially universal appeal of UFC. Is there like a top spin that the UFC organization is putting on it that is giving it such a kind of like Trumpy or at least naturally Trump-aligned appeal for so many people?
Yeah. And so I talk about this in the piece as well, because that was really what I was trying to get into, because it's been difficult for me and for many other people I spoke to who are, more liberal politically, and but are still genuine, real fans of this sport and recognize the beauty in the sport and love it as an athletic expression. And the sort of frustration that a lot of them have felt over the years watching the politics of this sport and everything surrounding it, the politics and aesthetics of this sport just drifting further and further right. Part of the answer that I found, there's a lot of sort of different reason for this. One of the, if you want sort of the pop psychological reason behind it, that I wrote in the piece, is that fighting itself it's a fiercely individualistic sport. It's basically the least team sport that one can ever possibly do, right? Because the aim of the sport is just simply to beat up another person.
Right.
There is a collaborative aspect in fighting. You need to be a successful fighter. You need to have really good teammates, really good coaches, sparring partners, people who will train with you and do this work. But at the end of the day, when the actual competition comes out, it's you and one other guy in a cage. And, one of you is leaving a winner and the other is leaving a loser. And that kind of outlook, especially orienting your entire life and your entire sort of career on your ability to inflict violence on another person, lends itself, I think, very easily to people having a worldview that does see things in a very sort of stark black and white, that sees things in a very sort of immediately, it's you're either attacking or you're defending, and most of the time, most fighters, you always want to be attacking. These are things that all have very much played into the dominant sort of right-wing culture of the moment, which is a culture of we are constantly under attack, and the way to get through that is to fight back.
Right.
And I think it's very easy for a fighter to when you're in the gym and when that is your entire life to see the world in that way. There are a lot of other factors, but all of that is to say is that the general practitioner of MMA, the general fan of MMA, I think in general, is going to more often than not lean slightly to the right, I guess maybe because of the individualistic nature of the sport. But that doesn't mean that that is as a whole, that
Sure.
describes every person, that
Of
it
course.
describes every fighter. There's a ton of room in this for people, but that was sort of the answer that I came to. And the second part of it, which you were asking about, is, how has this been so successfully captured by the right wing and by specifically Donald Trump and the MAGA movement? And that goes into several things. It goes into Donald Trump and Dana White's personal relationship, but I think it also goes into the fact that the right wing has successfully been able to present a definition of masculinity in this country that involves sort of the constant threat of an ability to inflict violence. They have created a world in which everyone is coming to take from you,
Right.
and things that scare you or frighten you are out there, and they're real. And Donald Trump got elected twice by saying, I know what's scaring you, and I'm going to fight back against it. And I heard at these UFC events from his fans when he entered at Madison Square Garden, UFC 309, which was on November 16th, I think, 2024. This was Donald Trump's first public appearance after the election. And he, entered the arena to this absurd, enormous fanfare, and the Jumbotrons going wild, and the announcers on the pay-per-view, screaming out his name, Joe Rogan, practically squealing in delight as he comes in, flanked by Elon Musk and Kid Rock and Tulsi Gabbard. And at some point in the 15-minute standing ovation, I was talking to a couple of kids, and one of them said, I like that he enters like a fighter. Like, it gives me hope.
Right.
To see this political figure come out here, do a fighter walkout. And to get to the heart of what I think that represents and why it fits in so well in fighting is that the conservative movement in this country has really tapped into the fact that they've turned every political discussion into a fight, into a cage match, essentially, between one person who's fighting for you and one person who's fighting against you. And I think that when you're conditioned to see the world that way, and everyone inherently a little bit is, who among us has not ever wanted to punch our boss, or, someone who has aggrieved us on the street? You don't have to answer that, Max, don't worry. But
say that. First half of this show is me co-hosting with my boss, so obviously I've never felt that, but I've heard other people
who I've
describe
spoken
it.
to, wonderful man, never felt that towards him either. But, I think when you're watching a fight, something I kind of tried to get into in the piece, but maybe didn't say as explicitly. When you're watching one of these fights, all sports essentially are a form kind of wish fulfillment and fantasy. Like when you're watching an NFL game or something and you see someone get really laid out, or someone throw an incredible touchdown pass or something like that, a rational person is not thinking like, oh man, that's me, I could do that. But maybe what they are thinking, if they played a little football in high school, or they played or something like that, and they see Josh Allen, absolutely gun one sidearm to an open receiver or something, and they're thinking about that moment of triumph from their own life. They're projecting this on to the athletes that they're seeing.
Right.
And when you get that in such a distilled fashion in terms of fighting, it's like you go in there, you're rooting for your guy, and your guy wins. He slips outside of that jab, comes back with a right cross, and it lands flush, and the other guy just goes out like a light. You see him just crumple. You're projecting everything that's wrong in your life onto that moment, right?
Huh.
And there's a feeling of when you see the right guy go down in your mind, the right guy get hit and get punished, get knocked out, there's a sense of like that catharsis and justice where it's just like, for that little second, right? The guy who was fighting for me, he won, and all is right in the world. And so I don't know if people think about that explicitly when they're watching these fights, but I'm saying that's definitely part of the feeling when you're watching this just absolutely stark athletic spectacle,
Right.
that is often sold through a storyline of two fighters having something on the line in this fight, that you begin to think your fandom, your, like for a certain fighter is also on the line. If they lose, you're going to look silly to your friends. If they, who were saying, no, there's no chance they would win or something like that. It brings you into this, and it does the same thing that any other sport does, but it combines it with the fact that the only thing that the sport is the violence, is the turbocharged sort of catharsis of those moments that you may watch an entire 3-hour football game, for that one big hit, for that one dagger touchdown pass that really sticks it to the Chiefs and seals it that they're not going to win 3 Super Bowls in a row or something like that.
That's a really smart point about the UFC offering a kind of cathartic projection of feelings of strength and empowerment for people who are maybe feeling that they're not as strong or empowered in their personal lives as they want it to be. And the point you made earlier, especially about the UFC offering a kind of story about masculinity and about what masculinity is and should be. And I think that is something that really, in my mind, connects it with Trump's appeal, is speaking to a kind of longing for that. There was just a poll in the New York Times reporting that 80% of Republican men say society has grown too feminine, and the number of Republican men who say society should return to traditional gender norms has doubled in just the last 3 years, from 22% to 48%. Do you think that this is something that people in UFC world, and again, thinking of like both the people in the organization itself and also the media world around it, do they see themselves as speaking to this crisis, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not sure if it's thought about in that sort of philosophical terms in the UFC. I think it's definitely thought of in those kind of marketing terms, where they see these trends and they think, oh man, the 18 to 25 demo, which I wrote about in the piece, the 18 to 25 demo is pissed off. They've got worse earning potential than even, the much decried millennials like us. They've got nothing going for them. They're mad and they're looking for an outlet for that. And they're responding to these versions of masculinity presented by influencers who very much, are on the right side of the spectrum and who are advocating for those traditional gender roles. I think the UFC has realized that young men specifically are responding to those themes, both because to a certain extent, those themes are kind of the only ones out there around masculinity right now.
Yeah.
And the UFC has realized that they're responding to them in big ways because they are similar to Donald Trump, is it offers that demographic, that view of the world offers them sort of an easy fix to all of their problems. I know you on Offline talk a lot about politics, and the rest of the Crooked ecosystem focuses directly on politics. But, what's been at the core of both of Donald Trump's, or all 3 of Donald Trump's candidacies for president, is he has said, there are problems in America and I will fix them. And the UFC, I think, buys into a version of masculinity that says, like, there are problems in your life, clean your room and go to the gym. It's the standard, this stuff started getting introduced with Jordan Peterson and with all of these other influencers who are telling young men, like, you can fix your life by going out and doing these things. And some of it is good advice. Like, it is good advice to go to the gym. I would recommend that anyone listening to this show go try martial arts. Like, they rock. It's amazing. Like, it is literally the only thing that keeps my sanity intact on a week-to-week basis is being able to go to a place where, like, I am just using my body freely and expressing myself as such, and I'm not thinking about literally anything else other than the fact that, like, is Eric going to be able to land his right cross on me? And I don't want that to happen. Right?
Offline is brought to you by Lumen. Did you know that when your metabolism is working properly, you will feel the benefits in literally every aspect of your life? Lumen is a valuable tool that gives you insights to create a healthy metabolism for your body. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism whether you're burning mostly fats or carbs. Then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time, and Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. Lumen is all the rage here at Cricket. A couple of the staff's using it. You're blowing into it. Suddenly you get you get all your numbers.
Yeah, you get your numbies.
And they can give you a nutrition plan. They can tell you how much fat or carbs you're burning. It's great. It's great. Because your metabolism is at the center of everything your body does. Optimal metabolic health translates to a bunch of benefits, including easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness results, better sleep, and more. Take the next step to improving your health. Go to lumen.me/offline to get 20% off your Lumen. That's lumen.me/offline for 20% off your purchase. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode. Offline is brought to you by Z-Biotics Pre-Alcohol. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, I certainly don't bounce back the next day like I used to.
No.
And so you have to make a choice. You either have a great night or you have a great next day. Until I found pre-alcohol. Z-Biotics Pre-Alcohol Probiotic Drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make pre-alcohol your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. I was out last weekend. I forgot it.
Oh, no.
Had a friend bring an extra. That's how important it was. Someone else at the table had never heard of it before. She was like, "What are you doing with that thing? What are you?" And I told her all about it, and she's like, "Seriously? This works? Is this just like something you guys sell on the pod?" It's like, no, it works.
It happens to be both.
It happens to be both, and it worked. This college hoop season, don't let anything sideline your celebrations.
Hoops.
Grab pre-alcohol before you go out and be ready to cheer on your team all day and all night long. Go to zbiotics.com/offline to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use offline at checkout. Z-Biotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/offline and use the code offline at checkout for 15% off.
You talked about the story that the UFC tells implicitly about what masculinity is and what it should be. What do you think that story implies about what's wrong with masculinity, or what's missing, or what the problem is? Because I feel like the way that it contextualizes both the solution and the problem for its audience is an important way to understand both its appeal and also where it's leading people.
Yeah, I think there's a very specific way that the UFC presents masculinity. And part of it is that they don't really have to do a huge amount of message shaping to get this. They have the stars of their organization, and most of the people who are visibly involved with it are fighters, and the vast majority of those fighters are men. The UFC has a lot of very successful women's divisions. It has very successful and extremely talented women's fighters. But, fighting still is, for the most part, a man's game. And like the distribution of most sports, the male divisions are often, watched more, they're cared about more, and the male fighters are often the bigger stars. I think true fans of the sport don't see it that way. I think they think that they're some of the most electrifying fighters in the UFC. Zhang Weili, for example, and a whole bunch of other fighters are women. But I think it's easy for the UFC to show this version of masculinity, which is you endure pain to go out and to win, and that you are going to overcome challenges in your life by basically fighting through them, by pushing through the pain. It's the classic, football coach with a t-shirt, pain is weakness leaving the body. And the fighters themselves embody this. They talk a lot of the times when they do express vulnerability, and some of them definitely do. It's always presented in a way that it's just like, I had to identify this about myself and then come up with my tactical plan to overcome it. And here's how I did. And I won my next fight because of that. And it's always in the UFC, it's always leading them towards a direct conflict where you win or you lose. And the attitude behind it, even if you lose, it's like, well, I learned from that and I will come back as a stronger man. I will come back as this isn't going to change me. I'm going to double down on who I am. And I think that that's been incredibly powerful to a generation of young men, especially those who have been through COVID and who have been through a lot of experiences in their generation's lifetime where things have not gone well, where things have been, difficult, like any generation, like millennials did as well. But the answer to that always has been not necessarily, and I'm not saying that there's an implicit good in any of this, but like introspection and, openness and things like that. But there has been like, you need to reassert control over your life. You need to, it's a very conservative outlook on the world. You need to assert control over everything you need to do. You need to be disciplined. You need to be, aggressive when you need to be aggressive. You need to be, focused and sharp and on the ball. You need to lock in, as the kids say. You need to, and that I think is a version of masculinity that is truly embodied by a lot of the UFC's fighters, because to a certain extent, you do have to see the world that way to be good at fighting. And that's something that the UFC has realized they can market
right
until the end of days.
Well, that makes me very curious about your experience with mixed martial arts, because you're, obviously much more left-wing guy, but are involved in this sport that kind of naturally aligns with right-wing ways of thinking. It makes me curious what those gyms are like. Like, are they all kind of MAGA right-wing spaces, even in Brooklyn?
So what's interesting about this is I've spent so long describing why mixed martial arts lends itself so easily to a right-wing point of view. And I think what attracted me to martial arts in general and to MMA as well is that I don't really think it has to. And a lot of aspects of this don't embody those things. So gyms in general around the country, simply because of the politics of the moment and the general sort of male-heavy demographics of people that go to MMA gyms, I think you would probably find on average around the country, they may be trended slightly more conservative than the general population as a whole, right? The environment in some of these gyms can be overtly masculine. It can be, in some areas be a little toxic. You don't see very much of that in New York, in Brooklyn especially. But you also don't see a ton of it elsewhere around the country, because the other aspect of martial arts and of fighting in general and of learning how to use your body in this way is that there has to be an enormous amount of respect involved, because you're not doing something like baseball or tennis even. I compare fighting to tennis all the time because I played relatively competitive tennis when I was a kid. And when I describe to people what the actual, sport of fighting is like, I'm like, the only thing it really compares to is like extremely high level singles tennis. But instead of like losing a point, you might break your nose. But when you're in a fighting gym, the way that people are judged is how they comport themselves on the mats, how they respond to training, how they respond to their training partners. And there's not a lot of room in a successful and a well-run MMA gym for someone who is going to be disrespectful and who is going to treat other people poorly. And so you get these kind of strange spaces where I have heard wildly not politically correct stuff in a gym, but I've also trained with people who are all over the sexuality and the gender spectrum. And for the most part, in any good gym, I think that you will generally find that, yeah, maybe, I'm sure, I'm obviously a cisgendered person. I find it much easier to come into these spaces. But, I know a lot of people who are not that, who have very positive experiences with martial arts. And that's because at a certain point, what race a person is, what culture they come from, what background, what religion, what gender they are, what sexuality they are, that kind of stops mattering when the only thing that matters to them is like, can you learn from them? Or if you're, sparring or something like that, can they hit you in the face? Like, getting hit in the face by the 120-pound stunt woman in my gym feels just as bad as getting hit in the face by the 125-pound janitor that's next to her. Like, and he's a man and she's a woman, and like it doesn't matter. Like, Hannah kicked me in the face 2 months ago and my jaw didn't like clothes right for about a week, you know? It doesn't, and that doesn't matter. Like, the fact that she's a woman, like, my face still hurt, you know? Like, it's not... So where that leaves me with the culture of martial arts, I think, is that there are these aspects of it, of the communal respect and of the sort of humility that participating in a sport like that teaches you, that they get mentioned in this sort of conception of masculinity. You know, the UFC always plays up like great moment of respect in between their fighters, like et cetera, because they know that people want to tap into that as well. It's a shame to me, I think, that often with fighting, people focus on, and the UFC has, you know, really focused on empowering the worst sides of this athletic endeavor rather than the best ones. They've focused on the divisiveness and the, you know, the bad blood and the beefs and things like that. And there's always going to be some of that in sports. It's part of what makes sports fun, you know, like if there's Philly sports fans out here and they hear me saying like bad blood isn't a fun part of sports, like, don't come for me. I love it too. You guys are crazy. Like, you know, everyone loves a good rivalry, right? But there is a way of conceptualizing mixed martial arts and this sport that doesn't necessarily rely solely on this sort of regressive, aggressive version of masculinity.
Well, it really makes me wonder if there's a version of, I guess, MMA or something like it that speaks to those needs that we've been talking about, that like have brought so many people to the sport, or that the thing that people feel it is addressing for them, or that it's exciting for them about it, that is maybe not so extremely right-wing coded, because obviously there are aspects of the sport, like you said, that lend itself to it, but there are also aspects of the sport, like you're talking about, that are more aligned around community, which to me feels like a much more kind of left-wing coded idea.
I think that, unfortunately or fortunately, MMA itself, I don't think is going to be the primary driver of it. I think that the culture inside mixed martial arts is always going to be more of a reflection of where our society is at in general, rather than the other way around, if that makes sense. And, you know, you've seen this even among the sort of cynical business decisions that the UFC has made in between the Biden presidency and the Trump presidency. You know, Dana White has not always been full MAGA. You know, his relationship with Donald Trump, which, you know, we haven't fully discussed, but it's all in the piece. They've known each other for decades. They've been involved in one another's businesses for decades. Trump played a very close hand in, you know, sort of the rise of Dana White's UFC. But White for a long time has really kind of tried to split the cultural gap. He for a while was operating much more on sort of like a Roger Goodell level, where the NFL is always, sure, during the Bush years, they couldn't stop doing military flyovers and having soldier reunited with son and golden retriever dog on halftime at the 50-yard line, you know, and stuff like that. But then tempering themselves to be like, you know, now we've got stop racism on the back of helmets, and like there's a pride flag over some stadiums and things like that. Like White, to a certain extent, has tried to kind of play those waters, but I think the big change was when he saw the strength and power of this MAGA movement, and especially the referendum that it saw in 2024, when it was basically ushered in as like, this is where the country is at. This is the dominant sort of cultural force in the country right now. I think that if that changes, and if that changes through politics, if that changes through outside culture, I think that we'll see more of a reflection of that in mixed martial arts. Like I said, these athletes in the sport, they can trend towards right-wing views, but there's so much in it, and there's so much, like, in the athletes that I see, a lot of them as well, that shows that there is room for those broader conceptions of masculinity. There is room for a, I would say, sort of more holistic and less, I guess, kind of jingoistic and fear-driven conception of this sport and culture at large. There's room for that in this sport. But I think it's going to take kind of a broader cultural reimagining of American society to get there. And I think as well, it might take something other than the UFC, which is a difficult proposition, because right now, if you're an MMA fan, the UFC is pretty much all that you've got.
Yeah, I feel like one thing I'm taking away from this is that the UFC as an organization, we are not going to be welcoming to the resistance anytime soon, but that if people felt that they wanted a version of something like MMA or MMA itself that was speaking to those needs, but did it in a way that was more aligned with left-wing values, that the sport does have room for that.
Yeah, I think that it does, but I want to be clear that you're not ever going to, there's not going to be like a rule set change where you can make like leftist MMA or something like that. The sport I think is the sport.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But I do think that there is room within the culture of the sport and to still get what the sport offers, even in terms of that, kind of violent catharsis and that which right now I think that catharsis has been sort of grafted onto, like we've been talking about, some sort of ugly cultural trends, right? But I think that there is a way that can be a much more universal thing, that people can still gain that enjoyment out of the sport without it, always explicitly feeling like that. I mean, I get that catharsis from the sport right now.
Yeah.
I'm probably thinking about very different people when I project those fantasies onto the fighter that I don't like getting knocked out than
right.
Some of the Donald Trump, for instance, is when he watches that. But I think the sport is good. Like, the sport shouldn't go anywhere. I think that how it's organized, who runs it, and who is profiting off of it, I wish that some of those things were different. And I'm not sure how we get them that way, but I do think that there is room inside the cultural phenomenon of mixed martial arts for that change to happen.
Jack Crosbie, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Max.